Miss Marple and Murder on Christmas Morning, narrated by Edward from Warm Pages. I'm truly glad you're here with us tonight. I'm curious, do you listen to these stories before bed, while sipping tea, or during a peaceful moment in your day? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear. And don't forget to subscribe as we share new stories every single day. Now, let's move on to the story. Chapter 1, Carols at First Light. The snow had begun to fall just after midnight on Christmas morning, and by the time the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, the village of St Mary Mead lay beneath a pristine blanket of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something from a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple, adjusting her woolen scarf against the crisp morning air, picked her way carefully along the lane that led to the village green, a basket of knitted mittens tucked securely under her arm. The annual Christmas morning carol service had been a tradition in St Mary Mead for as long as anyone could remember, and despite the early hour and the weather, a small but devoted crowd had gathered around the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel in the centre of the green. The village choir, their breath-forming small clouds in the frosty air, had just begun the opening notes of O Come, All Ye Faithful, when Miss Marple arrived. She paused at the edge of the gathering, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar faces of her neighbours. There was Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a fur-trimmed coat that had seen better days but still possessed an air of faded elegance. Dr. Haydock stood beside the vicar, his medical bag never far from his side even on Christmas morning. Young Mary Price from the post office clutched a hymnal with mittened hands, her clear soprano voice rising above the others in the crisp morning air. The mittens in Miss Marple's basket were destined for the children at the Christmas breakfast that Mr. Henry Westlake hosted each year at his manor house. It was a generous tradition, one that had begun some 15 years ago when the retired mill owner had first come to St Mary Mead. Every Christmas morning after the carol service, he would throw open the doors of his manor to provide a hearty breakfast for anyone in the village who might otherwise go without. The poor, the elderly, the lonely, all were welcome at Henry Westlake's table. As the choir moved into the second verse, Miss Marple found herself glancing toward the wrought-iron gates of Westlake Manor, visible through the bare branches of the elm trees that lined the lane. It was unusual, she thought, that Mr. Westlake himself was not here to hear the carols. In all the years she had known him, he had never missed the Christmas morning service, always arriving precisely at 6 o'clock with his brass carriage lantern to light his way through the pre-dawn darkness. The thought had barely formed in her mind when she noticed something that made her frown slightly. There, in the snow that had drifted against the manor's gates, she could see the clear impression of sleigh runners, as if someone had driven a pony sleigh right up to the entrance. But the marks didn't stop at the gates. They continued around the side of the property, toward the stable block that lay behind the main house. Miss Marple's attention was drawn back to the present as the choir began the first Noel, but her eyes continued to wander toward the manor. The windows of the house were dark, unusual for a morning when Mr. Westlake would normally be bustling about preparing for his annual feast. The stable block, on the other hand, showed a warm glow from within, suggesting that the building was heated and occupied. As the final notes of the carol drifted away across the snow-covered green, Miss Marple made her way toward the manor gates. The mittens could wait a few more minutes, she decided. There was something about the scene that didn't quite sit right with her, though she couldn't have said exactly what it was. Perhaps it was simply the absence of Mr. Westlake himself, or perhaps it was something more subtle, the way the snow had been disturbed around the gates, or the fact that the lantern he usually carried was nowhere to be seen. She paused at the gates, her sharp eyes taking in the details that others might have missed. The sleigh tracks were fresh, probably made within the last hour or two. But there was something else, a small sprig of holly, its bright red berries stark against the white snow, lay crushed and broken just inside the gates. It looked as though it had been torn from someone's clothing, or perhaps from a wreath that had been damaged in passing. The sound of voices from the direction of the green reminded her that the carol service was ending, and that people would soon be making their way to the manor for breakfast. She really should deliver the mittens and see if there was anything she could do to help with the preparations. but as she pushed open the gate, which she found was unlocked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The path to the main house was covered in snow, but the tracks leading to the stable block were clear and well defined. 3 sets of footprints, she noted, 1 set of heavy boots, 1 set of smaller, more delicate galoshes, and a 3rd set that appeared to be ordinary walking boots. All led toward the stable, and none seemed to lead away again. Miss Marple followed the tracks, her own sensible shoes crunching softly in the snow. The stable block was a handsome building of red brick, converted some years ago into a sort of games room and storage area where Mr. Westlake kept his collection of Christmas decorations and hosted various village functions. The warm glow she'd noticed from the green came from the windows, and she could see that the interior was indeed heated and lit. As she approached the door, she could hear voices from within. Young voices, she thought, though she couldn't make out the words. There was something urgent in the tone, something that made her quicken her pace despite the treacherous footing. The door to the stable block stood slightly ajar, and through the gap Miss Marple could see a scene that made her catch her breath. The interior had been decorated for Christmas, with garlands of evergreen draped from the rafters and a magnificent tree standing in one corner, surrounded by neat pyramids of wrapped presents. But it was not the decorations that drew her attention. It was the figure of a man slumped in a chair beside the gift table, his head fallen forward onto his chest in a posture that spoke unmistakably of death. Even from the doorway, Miss Marple could see that it was Henry Westlake, still dressed in his heavy overcoat and muffler, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of some early morning errand. Standing beside him, their faces pale with shock, were 2 young people whom she recognized as his nephew and niece, Gordon Westlake, home on leave from the Royal Air Force, and Flora Westlake, who had been helping her uncle manage his charitable trust fund. Miss Marple pushed the door open wider and stepped into the warm, pine-scented interior. The scene before her was one that would remain etched in her memory for years to come, not just because of the tragedy it represented, but because of the small details that her observant eyes immediately registered. The dented brass stocking holder that lay half hidden beneath a strand of tinsel. The fact that one of the Christmas stockings was missing from its usual place on the mantelpiece. And most intriguingly, the way the snow on the threshold had been disturbed, as if someone had recently entered and left in great haste. "My dear children," she said softly, her voice gentle but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in a crisis. "I think we'd better send for Dr. Haydock immediately." Chapter 2, A Body by the Gifts Table. Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes of Miss Marple's urgent telephone call, his medical bag in one hand and his hat still askew from his hurried departure from the carol service. The elderly doctor's face was grave as he entered the stable block, his practised eye immediately taking in the scene before him. "Poor old Henry," he murmured, setting down his bag and approaching the slumped figure with the careful, measured steps of a man who had attended too many such scenes over the years. "Gordon, Flora, you'd better step back a bit while I examine him." Miss Marple watched as the 2 young people moved away from their uncle's body, noting that Gordon's RAF uniform was slightly rumpled, as if he had dressed in haste, while Flora's woolen coat bore traces of snow on the shoulders. Both appeared genuinely shocked, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. Haydock asked, his hands moving with professional efficiency as he examined the deceased man. "We found him just a few minutes before Miss Marple arrived," Flora replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We came out to check on the presents and the heating before the breakfast guest arrived, and there he was, just sitting there." Gordon cleared his throat, his military bearings still evident despite the circumstances. "It was about 6:15 when we discovered him. We'd been in the main house since dawn, stoking the fires and preparing for the breakfast. Uncle Henry said he wanted to make one final check of the arrangements out here." Miss Marple's keen eyes continued to survey the scene while the doctor worked. The stable block had been transformed into a festive gathering place, with long tables arranged along one wall and the magnificent Christmas tree dominating the far corner. The presents were arranged in neat pyramids around the tree's base, each one wrapped in colourful paper and tied with ribbons. It was a generous display, representing Mr. Westlake's annual gifts to the village children and families in need. But it was the details that didn't quite fit the festive scene that captured Miss Marple's attention. The brass stocking holder that lay half concealed beneath a strand of tinsel appeared to be dented, as if it had been struck against something hard. The holder was an ornate piece, clearly valuable, and it seemed odd that it would be discarded so carelessly on the floor. "Dr. Haydock," she said quietly, "might I ask what you think caused Mr. Westlake's death?" The doctor straightened up, wiping his hands on his handkerchief. "At first glance, I'd say it was a massive stroke. Henry's been having some trouble with his blood pressure lately, and the excitement of Christmas morning combined with the cold weather and the exertion of preparing for the breakfast." He shrugged. "It's not uncommon for men of his age, I'm afraid." "A stroke," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "And yet, Doctor, if I might venture an observation, doesn't it seem rather coincidental that he should suffer such an attack here, in the stable block, rather than in the warmth and comfort of his own home?" Gordon stepped forward, his face flushed with what appeared to be indignation. "Miss Marple, I hardly think this is the time for speculation. My uncle was a generous man who worked tirelessly for the good of this village. If he chose to spend his final moments ensuring that the Christmas breakfast would be perfect for his guests, that's entirely in keeping with his character." "Of course, my dear boy," Miss Marple replied gently. "I meant no disrespect to your uncle's memory. It's simply that I've noticed one or two small details that seem rather curious." She moved closer to the Christmas tree, her eyes fixed on the mantelpiece that had been constructed along one wall to hold the traditional Christmas stockings. 3 stockings hung there, each one beautifully embroidered with a name: Gordon, Flora and Mrs. Jarvis, the housekeeper. But there was a 4th hook on the mantelpiece, one that stood conspicuously empty. "I notice that one of the stockings is missing," she observed. "Might I ask whose stocking it was?" Flora and Gordon exchanged glances, and it was Flora who answered. "It was Uncle Henry's own stocking. He always hung it there on Christmas Eve, filled with envelopes of money for the various village charities. £50 for the Church Restoration Fund, 50 for the Children's Home, 50 for the Widows' Relief Society, and so on." Her voice trembled slightly. "He was always so particular about his charitable giving." "And the stocking is missing now?" Miss Marple asked. "It appears so," Gordon replied stiffly. "Perhaps Uncle Henry removed it himself, intending to distribute the money personally during the breakfast." Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. "And the key to the breakfast hall strongbox? I assume the charitable donations were kept secure?" "Uncle Henry always kept the strongbox key on his watch chain," Flora said. "He was very careful about such things." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, moved closer to the body and examined the deceased man's waistcoat. "That's odd," he murmured. "There's no watch chain visible. Henry always wore his grandfather's gold watch and chain, never went anywhere without it." The implications of this discovery settled over the group like a cold mist. Miss Marple moved to examine the brass stocking holder more closely, careful not to disturb the scene but noting every detail. The dent in the metal was quite pronounced, and there were what appeared to be small traces of something dark on the surface. "Flora, my dear," she said softly, "when did you last see your uncle alive?" "This morning at about 5 o'clock, Flora replied. "Gordon and I were up early to stoke the fires throughout the house. Uncle Henry was in his dressing gown, having his morning tea. He said he wanted to make one final check of the stable arrangements before the guests arrived." "And that was the last time either of you saw him?" Gordon nodded. "We were busy with the fires and the breakfast preparations. The next time we saw him was—" He gestured helplessly toward the chair where his uncle's body sat. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the floor near the Christmas tree, where she noticed several small fragments of something that glittered in the light from the electric lamps. Kneeling carefully, she could see that they were pieces of glass, apparently from some kind of lantern or lamp. "Dr. Haydock," she said, "didn't Mr. Westlake usually carry a brass carriage lantern when he made his rounds in the early morning?" "Yes, indeed he did," the doctor confirmed. An old-fashioned thing, but he was quite attached to it. Said it reminded him of his childhood. Then where is it now? Miss Marple asked. And what caused these glass fragments to be scattered on the floor? The questions hung in the air like smoke, and Miss Marple could see that both Gordon and Flora were growing increasingly uncomfortable with her observations. There was something about their manner, a tension that went beyond the natural grief and shock of discovering a beloved relative's body, that suggested they were holding back information. "I think," Miss Marple said finally, "that we should perhaps send for Inspector Slack. While Dr. Haydock may be quite right about the cause of death, there are certain irregularities that I believe warrant official investigation." "Is that really necessary?" Gordon asked, his voice tight with what might have been anxiety. "Surely we can handle this as a family matter. Uncle Henry wouldn't want a lot of fuss and bother." "I'm afraid, my dear boy," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness, "that the decision is no longer ours to make. The missing stocking, the absent watch chain, the broken lantern glass and the dented stocking holder all suggest that your uncle's death may not have been quite as natural as it first appeared." She turned to Dr. Haydock, who was regarding her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Doctor, I believe you'll find that if you examine Mr. Westlake's head more carefully, you may discover evidence of a blow. The stocking holder, despite its decorative appearance, is quite heavy enough to cause serious injury if used as a weapon." The silence that followed this pronouncement was broken only by the soft crackling of the electric heaters that warmed the stable block. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the sounds of the village preparing for Christmas morning seemed very far away indeed. Chapter 3. The Suspicious Stocking. Inspector Slack arrived at Westlake Manor with his usual air of brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple could see that he was not entirely pleased to be called away from his own Christmas morning. The inspector was a man of medium height with thinning hair and a perpetually sceptical expression, and he had learned from past experience to pay attention to Miss Marple's observations, however reluctantly. "Well then, Miss Marple," he said as he entered the stable block, "Dr. Haydock tells me you have some concerns about this death. Natural causes not good enough for you?" "I merely think, Inspector, that there are certain aspects of the scene that merit careful examination," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Perhaps you might begin by speaking with Mrs. Jarvis, the housekeeper. I believe she may have important information about the missing stocking." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Jarvis appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears and her hands twisted in her apron. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back severely, and the kind of lined face that spoke of years of hard work and faithful service. "Oh, Inspector," she wailed. "What a terrible thing to happen on Christmas morning. Poor Mr. Henry, and him so looking forward to the breakfast for the village folk." Inspector Slack guided her to a chair away from the body, his manner surprisingly gentle. "Now then, Mrs. Jarvis, I understand there's something missing from the Christmas display. Can you tell me about Mr. Westlake's stocking?" Mrs. Jarvis dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "Oh yes, sir, it was his pride and joy, that stocking was. Every Christmas Eve he'd fill it with the envelopes, each one containing £50 in crisp new notes. The Church Restoration Fund, the Children's Home, the Widows' Relief Society, the Hospital Auxiliary, and half a dozen other charities. £300 in total it was." "And this stocking is missing?" Inspector Slack asked. "Gone, sir, completely gone. And what's more, the key to the breakfast hall strongbox is missing too. Mr. Henry always kept it on his watch chain, never let it out of his sight. Said it was his responsibility to keep the charitable funds secure." Miss Marple had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Mrs. Jarvis, when did you last see Mr. Westlake with his watch chain?" "Yesterday evening, miss, when he was making his final preparations. He was very particular about checking the strongbox, making sure all the donations were properly sorted and secured. That's where he kept the larger sums, you see, the ones that couldn't fit in the Christmas stocking." Flora, who had been standing quietly near the Christmas tree, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Jarvis, are you quite certain about the amounts? I helped Uncle Henry with his charitable accounts, and I don't recall such large sums being involved." The housekeeper's face flushed slightly. "Miss Flora, I may be getting on in years, but I've kept this house for Mr. Henry for 15 years, and I know his ways. Every Christmas Eve he'd count out those £50 notes himself, seal them in envelopes, and place them in that embroidered stocking. It was his Christmas tradition, as regular as clockwork. Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "This strong box, Mrs. Jarvis, where is it located?" "In the breakfast hall, sir, built into the wall behind the serving hatch. Mr. Henry had it installed when he first began the Christmas breakfast tradition. Said he wanted to keep the charitable funds separate from his personal finances." "And you're certain the key is missing?" Mrs. Jarvis nodded emphatically. "Gone with his watch chain, sir. Mr. Henry never went anywhere without that chain. It was his grandfather's, and he treasured it." Miss Marple moved closer to the mantelpiece, studying the remaining stockings with careful attention. "Mrs. Jarvis, were you responsible for hanging the stockings?" "Oh yes, miss. Every Christmas Eve I'd hang them up proper like. Mr. Gordon's, Miss Flora's, my own, and Mr. Henry's. His was the finest of the lot, embroidered with his initials in gold thread. His late wife made it for him during their first Christmas together, near on 30 years ago." Gordon stepped forward, his face showing signs of irritation. "Really, Inspector, I can't see why we're dwelling on these details. The stocking has obviously been misplaced, and as for the watch chain, perhaps Uncle Henry simply forgot to put it on this morning. He was getting on in years, after all." "Mr. Gordon," Inspector Slack said sharply, "I'll thank you to let me conduct this investigation in my own way. Now, Mrs. Jarvis, I understand you saw Mr. Westlake early this morning?" "Indeed I did, sir. I was up at 4:30, as always on Christmas morning, to start the preparations for the breakfast. Mr. Henry was already awake, pacing about the house in his dressing gown. He seemed quite agitated about something." "Agitated? In what way?" Mrs. Jarvis wrung her hands. "Well, sir, he kept muttering about making sure everything was right and checking the arrangements one more time. He was more flustered than I'd ever seen him. Usually he was calm as anything on Christmas morning, but today he seemed worried about something." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Did he say anything specific about what was troubling him?" "Not exactly, miss, but he did mention something about unexpected complications, and said he needed to set things straight before the guests arrived. He was very insistent about going out to the stable block alone, said he had some business to attend to there." Flora's face had grown quite pale during this recitation. "Mrs. Jarvis, you're making Uncle Henry sound as if he were in some kind of distress. He was simply being thorough, as he always was. The Christmas breakfast was very important to him." "Miss Flora," Mrs. Jarvis replied with dignity, "I've known your uncle longer than you've been alive, and I can tell the difference between thoroughness and worry. Mr. Henry was troubled about something, mark my words." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "Right then, I think we'd better have a look at this breakfast hall strongbox. Mrs. Jarvis, if you'd be so good as to show us the way." The little group made their way from the stable block to the main house, following a path that had been cleared of snow. Miss Marple noted that the house itself was a handsome Georgian building, well maintained and clearly the home of a man of considerable means. The breakfast hall was a large, cheerful room with long tables already set for the Christmas feast, and the strongbox was indeed built into the wall behind the serving hatch, its steel door closed and locked. "Have you tried the door?" Inspector Slack asked. "No, sir," Mrs. Jarvis replied. "Wouldn't presume to do such a thing without Mr. Henry's permission." Inspector Slack rattled the handle, but the strongbox remained firmly locked. "We'll need to get this open somehow. Dr. Haydock, in your professional opinion, would it be possible for someone to have struck Mr. Westlake with that stocking holder hard enough to cause death?" Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, nodded gravely. "I've had another look at the body, and I'm afraid Miss Marple was quite right. There are signs of a blow to the head, quite severe enough to cause unconsciousness. Whether it was the direct cause of death, or whether the shock brought on the stroke." He shrugged. "Either way, the blow was certainly a contributing factor." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of Gordon and Flora, noting the way Gordon's jaw tightened and how Flora's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coat more tightly around her. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, I think you'll find that the mystery of the missing stocking and the missing key are intimately connected. Someone wanted access to that strong box, and they were prepared to go to considerable lengths to obtain it. You think this was robbery? Inspector Slack asked. I think, Miss Marple replied carefully, that the motive may have been more complex than simple theft. The Christmas stocking, after all, contained a considerable sum of money, but it was money destined for charity. Someone who knew about Mr. Westlake's traditions, someone who had access to the house and grounds, someone who knew exactly where to find him on Christmas morning. She let the implications of her words sink in, watching as both Gordon and Flora shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the bells of St. Mary Mead Church began to chime the hour, a solemn counterpoint to what should have been a morning of celebration and joy. Chapter 4, Footprints and a Cracked Lantern. Inspector Slack was nothing if not thorough in his methods, and once the initial shock of discovering that Henry Westlake's death was not entirely natural had settled, he set about examining the scene with the methodical precision that had served him well throughout his career. Miss Marple watched approvingly as he produced a magnifying glass and began a careful inspection of the stable block courtyard. Now then, he muttered, kneeling in the snow despite the damage to his trousers, let's see what story these footprints have to tell us. The snow in the courtyard was perhaps 3 inches deep, and the various tracks were clearly visible despite the continuing snowfall. Inspector Slack traced each set of prints with his finger, occasionally making notes in his book. 3 distinct sets of footprints, he announced, looking up at the assembled group. First, we have a set of ordinary walking boots, size 9 I'd estimate, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. These would be Mr. Westlake's prints, leading from the house to the stable block. He moved to the second set of tracks. Heavy military boots, size 10 with regulation soles. These would be yours, Mr. Gordon, I presume? Gordon nodded stiffly. Yes, Inspector. I came out to the stable block this morning to check on the heating arrangements, as I mentioned earlier. And the third set, Inspector Slack continued, are smaller, more delicate prints, made by galoshes with a decorative pattern on the sole. Miss Flora's, I believe. Flora's voice was barely audible. Yes, Inspector. I accompanied Gordon to ensure everything was ready for the breakfast guests. Miss Marple had been following the inspector's examination with keen interest, and now she stepped forward. Inspector, might I point out something rather curious about these tracks? By all means, Miss Marple. Notice that while all 3 sets of prints lead to the stable block, only 2 sets lead away again. Mr. Westlake's prints end at the stable door, but both Gordon's and Flora's prints can be traced returning to the house. Inspector Slack frowned, studying the snow more carefully. You're quite right, but that's easily explained. Mr. Westlake was found dead in the stable, so naturally his prints wouldn't lead away from the building. Of course, Miss Marple agreed. But I wonder if you might examine the timing of these prints more closely. The snow began falling at midnight, and it's been quite steady since then. The deepest prints would be the oldest, wouldn't they? Inspector Slack considered this, then began examining the various tracks with renewed attention. After several minutes, he looked up with a puzzled expression. That's odd. Mr. Westlake's prints appear to be the most recent, made when there was less snow on the ground. But if he came out here last, after Gordon and Flora had already returned to the house... Precisely, Miss Marple said softly. It suggests that Mr. Westlake was brought to the stable block, rather than coming here of his own accord for his usual morning inspection. Gordon's face flushed with anger. That's a preposterous suggestion. Uncle Henry came out here every Christmas morning to check the arrangements. It was his routine. Indeed it was, Miss Marple replied calmly. But according to Mrs. Jarvis, he was already agitated about something when she saw him at 4:30. And the pattern of these footprints suggests that he came out here after you and Flora had already made your visit to the stable block. Flora wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite her heavy coat. Perhaps he made a second trip. Perhaps he wasn't satisfied with the arrangements and wanted to check them again. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. But there's another detail that I find quite interesting. She moved to a spot near the stable door where the snow had been disturbed and pointed to what appeared to be several small dark fragments scattered on the white surface. "Inspector, I believe these are pieces of glass from Mr. Westlake's brass carriage lantern." Inspector Slack crouched down to examine the fragments more closely. "You're right, Miss Marple, and there are quite a few pieces here, suggesting that the lantern was broken with some force." "But where is the rest of the lantern?" Miss Marple asked. "The brass housing, the handle, the base. Surely such a substantial piece wouldn't simply disappear." A systematic search of the area around the stable block revealed nothing, and Inspector Slack was beginning to look frustrated. The lantern could have been taken away, disposed of elsewhere on the property. Or, Miss Marple suggested, it could have been hidden somewhere close by, somewhere that we haven't thought to look. Dr. Haydock, who'd been quietly observing the proceedings, cleared his throat. "Inspector, I wonder if I might make a suggestion. The stable block has several storage areas, doesn't it? Tack rooms, feed bins, that sort of thing." "Of course," Inspector Slack replied. "We should search the entire building thoroughly." The search of the stable block proved more revealing than anyone had expected. In addition to the main room where the Christmas festivities were to be held, there were 3 smaller rooms that had once housed horses but were now used for storage. The second of these rooms yielded an interesting discovery. "Here we are," Inspector Slack announced, emerging from the storage room with a brass object in his hands. "What's left of Mr. Westlake's lantern?" The brass housing was badly dented, and the glass panels were completely shattered, but the lantern was still recognisable. More importantly, there were dark stains on the brass that looked suspiciously like blood. "I'll need to have this examined properly," Inspector Slack said. "But it appears that the lantern was used as a weapon." Miss Marple studied the damaged lantern with interest. "Inspector, might I suggest that you examine the boots of everyone present? If the lantern was used as a weapon and then hidden in the storage room, the person who handled it might have traces of the broken glass on their footwear." This suggestion proved to be remarkably prescient. While Flora's delicate galoshes showed no signs of glass or other foreign matter, Gordon's heavy military boots were a different story. The left heel bore several small pieces of glass embedded in the leather, and there was a distinct smear of what appeared to be candle wax on the sole. "Mr. Gordon," Inspector Slack said sternly, "I think you'd better explain how glass from your uncle's lantern came to be embedded in your boot." Gordon's face had gone very pale, but his voice remained steady. "I must have stepped on the glass fragments without realising it. When we found Uncle Henry's body, I was naturally upset and not watching where I was walking." "And the wax? I don't know. Perhaps from the Christmas candles in the stable block." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I'm afraid that won't do, my dear boy. The Christmas candles in the stable block are electric, part of the modern fixtures your uncle installed. This wax appears to be from an old-fashioned candle, the kind that would have been used in Mr. Westlake's brass lantern." The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the sound of snow falling against the windows of the stable block. Flora had begun to cry quietly, and Gordon was staring at his boots as if seeing them for the first time. "There's something else," Miss Marple continued softly. "The timing of the footprint suggests that Mr. Westlake was brought to the stable block, but his own prints are the most recent. This implies that he was unconscious when he was brought here, and that he regained consciousness briefly before succumbing to his injuries." Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. "That would be consistent with the head injury, a blow severe enough to cause unconsciousness, followed by a period of partial recovery, then death from the combined effects of the trauma and the stroke it induced." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Mr. Gordon, I think you'd better tell us exactly what happened here this morning, and I'd advise you to tell the truth because the evidence is painting a very clear picture." Gordon looked around the group, his eyes finally settling on his sister's tear-stained face. For a moment it seemed as if he might continue to protest his innocence, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said quietly. "Uncle Henry wasn't supposed to be hurt." The admission hung in the air like a pall of smoke, and Miss Marple felt a familiar sadness settle over her. Another Christmas morning, another family torn apart by greed and desperation. She had seen it all too often before, and she knew that the full story, when it finally emerged, would be both tragic and sordid. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should all go back to the house and discuss this properly. The snow is getting heavier, and I suspect we all have a great deal to talk about." Chapter 5. The Carol Book and the Codicil. The drawing room of Westlake Manor was a comfortable, well-appointed space that spoke of its owner's prosperity and refined taste. Heavy velvet curtains framed the tall windows, and a cheerful fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpets and mahogany furniture. Under different circumstances, it would have been the perfect setting for a Christmas morning gathering, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension and unspoken accusations. Inspector Slack had positioned himself near the fireplace, his notebook open and his pen poised, while Dr. Haydock sat in one of the leather armchairs, his medical bag at his feet and his expression grave. Miss Marple had chosen a chair near the window, where the grey morning light allowed her to observe the faces of the others with her usual keen attention to detail. Gordon stood near the bookshelf, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the weight of his partial confession, while Flora had collapsed into a chair near the door, her face pale and her hands trembling. Mrs. Jarvis hovered anxiously in the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or go. "Now then, Mr. Gordon," Inspector Slack began, "you've admitted that your uncle's death wasn't entirely accidental. I think it's time you told us exactly what happened." Gordon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his military uniform suggested. "It's not what you think, Inspector. I never intended to hurt Uncle Henry. The whole thing it was a misunderstanding that got completely out of hand." "Suppose you start at the beginning," Miss Marple said gently. "What brought you to the stable block so early this morning?" Gordon glanced at his sister, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "It started yesterday evening, actually. Uncle Henry had been acting strangely all week, ever since I arrived home on leave. He kept muttering about setting his affairs in order and making sure everything was done properly. Yesterday after dinner he called Flora and me into his study." "What did he want to discuss?" Inspector Slack asked. "His will," Flora said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. "Uncle Henry said he'd been reconsidering some of his arrangements, and he wanted to make some changes." Gordon nodded. He'd always told us that the manor house would come to Flora and me jointly after his death, along with a substantial portion of his estate. But yesterday evening, he said he'd had second thoughts about leaving the property to family members. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What sort of second thoughts?" "He said he'd been reading about wealthy families who'd lost their way, who'd become idle and self-indulgent because they'd never had to work for anything. He was concerned that inheriting the manor might not be the best thing for our characters." Gordon's voice was bitter. "He talked about the children's convalescent home that had been trying to buy property in the area, and how they needed a suitable building for their work." Inspector Slack made a note. "So he was planning to leave the manor to charity instead of to his family?" "That's what he said," Flora whispered. He'd already contacted his solicitor about drawing up a new codicil to his will. Mr. Treadgold was supposed to come round this morning after the Christmas breakfast to make it all official. "But that's not what happened," Miss Marple observed. "Mr. Treadgold didn't come round this morning, did he?" Gordon shook his head. "No, because Uncle Henry had a change of heart during the night. He came to my room at about 4 o'clock this morning, very agitated, saying that he had made a terrible mistake and that he needed to destroy the new codicil before Mr. Treadgold arrived." Mrs. Jarvis stepped forward from the doorway. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Gordon, but that's not quite right. I heard Mr. Henry in his study at 4:30, and he was talking to himself about putting things right and making sure the proper document was signed. But he didn't sound like a man who wanted to destroy anything. He sounded like a man who was trying to correct a mistake." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Mrs. Jarvis, did you see Mr. Westlake in his study?" "Yes, miss. I was passing by on my way to the kitchen, and the door was ajar. Mr. Henry was at his desk with some papers spread out in front of him, and he had that old choir hymnal open beside them." "A choir hymnal?" Inspector Slack asked. "What would he want with a hymnal at that hour of the morning?" "Mr. Henry kept important papers in that old book," Mrs. Jarvis explained. said it was the safest place for them because no thief would think to look in a book of Christmas carols. He'd hollowed out the pages, you see, made a secret compartment. The implications of this revelation were not lost on anyone in the room. Inspector Slack immediately stood up. "I think we'd better have a look at this study, and at this hymnal." The study was a smaller, more intimate room than the drawing room, lined with books and dominated by a large oak desk. The desk was neat and orderly, with no papers visible on its surface, but the safe in the corner stood open, its heavy door swinging slightly in the draught from the window. "The safe's been opened," Inspector Slack observed. "Was it like this when you found the body?" Gordon and Flora exchanged glances, and it was Flora who answered. We didn't come into the study this morning. We went straight from the house to the stable block." Miss Marple was examining the open safe with interest. "Inspector, notice that while the safe is open, nothing appears to have been taken. The jewellery, the cash, the bonds, they're all still here, apparently untouched." "Then what was the thief looking for?" Inspector Slack wondered. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "they weren't looking for valuables in the conventional sense. Mrs. Jarvis, where is this choir hymnal?" Mrs. Jarvis approached the desk hesitantly. "It should be right here, miss, in the top drawer. Mr. Henry always kept it." She pulled open the drawer and gasped. "It's gone!" A search of the study revealed the missing hymnal on a small table near the window, lying open to a page of the first Noel. But it was what lay inside the hollowed-out pages that captured everyone's attention. "Well, well," Inspector Slack murmured, carefully lifting out a folded document. "What have we here?" The document was clearly a legal codicil, written in formal language and bearing yesterday's date. But as Inspector Slack read it aloud, the contents proved to be quite different from what Gordon and Flora had described. "I, Henry Charles Westlake, being of sound mind and body, do hereby add this codicil to my last will and testament," the inspector read. "I bequeath my manor house and grounds, together with all furnishings and fixtures therein, to my beloved niece, Flora Catherine Westlake, in recognition of her faithful assistance with my charitable endeavours and her exemplary character." The silence that followed this reading was profound. Flora had gone completely white, while Gordon's face showed a mixture of shock and something that might have been relief. Inspector Slack continued, examining it more closely. "Appears to be in Mr. Westlake's handwriting, but it's unsigned and bears no witness signatures. In its current state, it would have no legal validity." Miss Marple was studying the faces of the two young people with her usual penetrating gaze. "How very interesting. So your uncle had prepared a codicil, leaving the manor to Flora alone, not to the children's home as you believed. And yet the document was never properly executed." "I don't understand," Flora said weakly. "Uncle Henry told us he was leaving everything to charity. Why would he write a codicil giving me the house?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "because he discovered something that changed his mind about his original plan. Or perhaps because someone had given him false information about what that original plan contained." Gordon's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. None of you understand how impossible the situation had become. Uncle Henry was going to ruin everything, throw away generations of family heritage for some misguided notion about character building." "And so you decided to take matters into your own hands," Inspector Slack said grimly. "You went to the stable block this morning to intercept your uncle, didn't you? To try to persuade him not to sign the codicil." "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did," Gordon said desperately. "I only wanted to talk to him, to make him see reason. But when I found him there, he had the Christmas stocking in his hands and he was acting so strangely, almost as if he suspected something. He started asking questions about Flora's involvement with the trust fund, about whether there had been any irregularities." Miss Marple's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Ah," she said softly, "now we're beginning to see the real motive, aren't we?" Chapter 6. Crumbs in the Christmas Cake. Miss Marple's quietly spoken words hung in the air like a challenge, and Inspector Slack turned to her with evident interest. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting," she replied carefully, "that we may have been looking at this matter from the wrong angle entirely. Gordon's concern about his inheritance, while no doubt genuine, may not have been the primary motive for this morning's tragic events. Flora had risen from her chair and was standing very still, her face pale but her eyes alert. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I resent the suggestion that I've done anything improper." "My dear child," Miss Marple said gently, "I'm not making accusations. I'm simply observing that your uncle's questions about irregularities in the trust fund seem to have alarmed Gordon considerably. Perhaps we should ask Mrs. Jarvis about your uncle's habits regarding his charitable accounts." Mrs. Jarvis, who had been following the conversation with growing bewilderment, stepped forward hesitantly. "Well, miss, Mr. Henry was very particular about his charitable giving. Every month he'd go over the accounts with Miss Flora, checking every expenditure, making sure the money was going where it was supposed to go." "And when did he last conduct such a review?" Miss Marple asked. "Just this past week, miss. He spent hours in his study with Miss Flora going through all the books. He seemed quite troubled by something he found." Flora's composure finally began to crack. Uncle Henry was getting old, and sometimes he became confused about things. He would question perfectly legitimate expenses, worry about transactions that were completely proper. Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "Miss Flora, perhaps you could explain your role in managing your uncle's charitable trust fund." "I helped him with the paperwork," Flora said defensively. "Uncle Henry was generous to a fault, but he wasn't particularly organised about record-keeping. I maintained the ledgers, wrote the cheques, handled the correspondence with the various charities." "Quite a responsibility for a young woman," Miss Marple observed, "and I imagine there were substantial sums involved." "The trust fund contained nearly £20,000, Flora admitted. Uncle Henry had been building it up for years, planning to distribute the money gradually to various worthy causes. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. £20,000? That's a considerable sum to manage. I hope there were proper safeguards in place." Gordon, who had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, suddenly burst out, "There's nothing wrong with Flora's management of the trust fund." Uncle Henry was becoming paranoid in his old age, seeing problems where none existed. "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "he was sufficiently concerned to spend hours reviewing the accounts just this past week. Mrs. Jarvis, did you happen to overhear any of these discussions?" Mrs. Jarvis wrung her hands nervously. "I couldn't help but hear raised voices, miss. Mr. Henry was asking Miss Flora about some expenditures that he couldn't account for. Something about payments to companies he'd never heard of, and cheques made out to individuals who weren't on his approved list of beneficiaries." "That's enough," Flora snapped, her composure finally shattering completely. Uncle Henry was losing his faculties. He couldn't remember half the things he'd authorised, and then he'd blame me for his own confusion. Miss Marple studied the young woman with her penetrating gaze. "My dear, I wonder if you might help us understand something that's been puzzling me. Mrs. Jarvis mentioned that your uncle was in the habit of eating a slice of Christmas cake for luck on Christmas morning. She also said that this morning the cake had been cut very early, at about 4 o'clock. Were you with your uncle when he had his slice of cake?" The question seemed to catch Flora off guard. Yes, I suppose I was. Uncle Henry asked me to join him in the kitchen. He said it was a family tradition, sharing the first slice of Christmas cake." "How charming," Miss Marple said. "And I suppose you cut the cake for him?" "Yes, I did." Uncle Henry's hands weren't as steady as they used to be. Mrs. Jarvis frowned. "Begging your pardon, Miss Flora, but that's not quite right. I saw the cake when I came down to start the breakfast preparations, and it looked like someone had cut a very neat rectangle from the marzipan layer and replaced it carefully. It was so precisely done that I almost didn't notice it at first." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. "A rectangle cut from the marzipan? That seems like an odd way to serve Christmas cake." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Jarvis, what size would you say this rectangle was?" "Oh, quite small, miss. Perhaps 2 inches by 1 inch. Just dusted over with icing sugar to disguise the cut. If you didn't look closely, you'd never notice it had been tampered with." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with understanding. "The perfect size, in fact, to conceal a small object. Tell me, Mrs. Jarvis, If someone wanted to hide something flat and rectangular in the Christmas cake, what might they choose? Well, miss, I suppose a key might fit if it was small enough. The strongbox key that Mr. Henry carried on his watch chain was quite compact. The implication of this observation was not lost on anyone in the room. Inspector Slack fixed Flora with a stern look. Miss Flora, I think you'd better explain exactly what happened when you shared that slice of Christmas cake with your uncle. Flora's face had gone ashen, but her voice remained steady. Uncle Henry was acting very strangely. He kept talking about setting things right and making sure the proper people were protected. He said he was worried about the safety of the strongbox key, and he wanted to hide it somewhere secure until after the Christmas breakfast. And you suggested hiding it in the Christmas cake? Miss Marple asked. It seemed like a harmless enough request. Uncle Henry was obviously worried about something, and if hiding the key made him feel better, I didn't see any harm in helping him. Gordon stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Flora, you can't seriously expect anyone to believe that Uncle Henry asked you to hide his strongbox key in a Christmas cake. The man was obsessive about security. He would never have done such a thing. You weren't there, Flora shot back. You don't know what he was thinking or what he asked me to do. Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. Perhaps we could examine the Christmas cake itself. If a key was indeed hidden there might be traces of its presence. The kitchen of Westlake Manor was a large, well-equipped room that spoke of Mrs. Jarvis's efficient management. The Christmas cake sat on a sideboard, a magnificent creation covered in white icing, and decorated with holly leaves and berries made of coloured marzipan. At first glance it appeared perfectly normal, but closer inspection revealed what Mrs. Jarvis had described, a rectangular section of the marzipan layer that had been cut out and replaced. There, Mrs. Jarvis pointed to the area in question. You can see where it's been disturbed if you look carefully. Inspector Slack examined the cake with his magnifying glass. The cut is very precise, made with a sharp knife, and there are crumbs of marzipan dusted around the edges, as if someone worked quickly and didn't have time to clean up properly. Miss Marple bent closer to examine the cake. Inspector, might I suggest that you carefully remove this section of marzipan? I have a feeling we may find more than just cake crumbs underneath. The removal of the replaced marzipan revealed a small cavity that had been carved out of the cake itself. The cavity was empty now, but its dimensions were indeed consistent with concealing a small flat object like a key. More interestingly, there were traces of something else in the cavity, small particles of what appeared to be candle wax. Wax, Inspector Slack observed. The same substance we found on Gordon's boot heel. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, which suggests that whoever hid the key in the cake also handled Mr. Westlake's brass lantern at some point. The wax would have come from the candle inside the lantern. Flora had been watching this examination with growing alarm. I don't understand what you're suggesting. If Uncle Henry asked me to hide the key, and then later decided to retrieve it himself, that would explain everything. It would indeed, Miss Marple agreed, if that's what actually happened. But I'm beginning to suspect that the true sequence of events was rather different. You see, my dear, I don't think your uncle ever asked you to hide that key at all. The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the soft sound of snow falling against the windows. Flora stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides, while Gordon watched her with an expression of growing horror. "Flora," he said quietly, "what did you do?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but implacable. "I think Flora removed the key from her uncle's watch chain while he was distracted, perhaps during their conversation about the trust fund accounts. She hid it in the Christmas cake, planning to retrieve it later when she could access the strongbox without her uncle's knowledge." "But why?" Inspector Slack asked. "What was in that strongbox that was worth stealing?" Miss Marple looked sadly at the young woman who stood before them, her composure finally crumbling under the weight of her deceptions. "I suspect we'll find that Flora had been helping herself to the trust fund money, and that her uncle was getting dangerously close to discovering her theft. The strongbox probably contained evidence of her embezzlement, perhaps the real records that contradicted the falsified ledgers she'd been showing her uncle." Flora's face crumpled and she began to sob. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just needed time to replace the money, to fix the accounts before Uncle Henry found out what I'd done. Chapter 7. A Sleigh Ride That Never Happened. Flora's confession brought a momentary silence to the kitchen, broken only by her quiet sobs and the steady ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple moved to the young woman's side, offering her a clean handkerchief with the kind of gentle sympathy that had comforted countless troubled souls over the years. "There, my dear," she said softly. "I know this is difficult, but I think you'll feel better if you tell us the whole truth. How much money did you take from the trust fund?" Flora dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Nearly £3,000 over the past 18 months. I never meant for it to go so far, but once I'd started, it became impossible to stop." Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "What did you need the money for?" "My fiancé," Flora whispered. "Charles Pemberton. He'd gotten himself into terrible debt with gambling, and he said if I didn't help him, he'd be ruined. He promised he'd pay it all back once his inheritance came through, but his grandfather kept living, and the debts kept mounting." Gordon's face was a mask of disbelief and disgust. "Flora, how could you be so foolish? Charles Pemberton is a known wastrel. Everyone in London knows he's fortune hunting." "You don't understand," Flora said desperately. "He loves me. He said we'd be married as soon as his financial situation improved. I was only borrowing the money temporarily." Miss Marple's expression was infinitely sad, but not surprised. She had seen too many young women deceived by charming men who preyed upon their emotions and their bank accounts. "And your uncle was beginning to discover the discrepancies in the accounts?" Flora nodded miserably. "This past week he went through everything with a fine-tooth comb. He found payments to companies that didn't exist, checks made out to people who weren't legitimate charity recipients. He was going to confront me about it this morning, after the Christmas breakfast." "So you stole his strongbox key to give yourself time to destroy the evidence," Inspector Slack said. "I thought if I could get into the strongbox and remove the original receipts and bank statements, I could claim they'd been lost or misfiled. Uncle Henry was getting forgetful about some things. I hoped he might accept that explanation." Miss Marple studied the young woman with her penetrating gaze. "But something went wrong with your plan, didn't it? Your uncle discovered that his key was missing sooner than you expected." Before Flora could answer, there was a knock at the kitchen door, and Mrs. Jarvis admitted a ruddy-faced man in a postman's uniform, snow dusting his shoulders and a worried expression on his weathered features. "Begging your pardon," the man said, "but I heard there'd been some trouble up at the manor. I'm Ned Tuke, the village postman, and I wanted to speak with someone about what I saw this morning." Inspector Slack looked up with interest. "What did you see, Mr. Tuke?" "Well, sir, I was making my early rounds delivering the Christmas post when I saw young Mr. Gordon here harnessing up the pony sleigh in the stable yard. Must have been about 5:30 it was. He said he was going to fetch coal from the station." Gordon's face flushed. "Yes, that's right. We were running low on coal for the fires." Ned Tuke scratched his head. "That's what puzzled me, sir. See, I'd already been to the station earlier, and there was no coal delivery expected today. Station master told me himself that all the Christmas deliveries had been made yesterday." The implications of this statement were not lost on anyone in the room. Inspector Slack fixed Gordon with a stern look. "Mr. Gordon, if you weren't going to collect coal, where exactly did you take that sleigh?" Gordon's military composure was beginning to crack under the weight of the accumulated evidence. I needed to think. I took the sleigh for a ride around the estate to clear my head." "A rather early hour for a pleasure ride in the snow," Miss Marple observed. "And in your testimony earlier, you said nothing about leaving the property at all. You claimed you were in the house with Flora, preparing for the breakfast." Ned Tuke cleared his throat. "If I might add something else, sir, I saw the sleigh come back about an hour later, and it looked to me like Mr. Gordon had someone with him. Someone wrapped in a blanket, sitting very still in the passenger seat." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Flora had stopped crying and was staring at her brother with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding. Gordon stood very still, his hands clenched at his sides, the facade of the dutiful nephew finally crumbling away. "Gordon," Flora whispered, What did you do?" Miss Marple moved closer to the young man, her voice gentle but implacable. "I think Gordon discovered your theft, my dear, and realised that if your uncle exposed the embezzlement, it would destroy both your reputation and his own. After all, he was home on leave, staying in the house where his uncle's charitable funds were being systematically stolen. Questions would inevitably be asked about his knowledge of and possible involvement in the scheme." Gordon's face had gone very pale. "You don't understand the position I was in. My military career, my reputation, everything would have been ruined if Flora's theft had come to light." "So you decided to take more direct action," Inspector Slack said grimly. "You used the sleigh to transport your uncle's body from wherever you actually killed him to the stable block, didn't you?" "It wasn't murder," Gordon protested. "I went to Uncle Henry's room to try to reason with him, to explain about Flora's situation and beg him not to involve the authorities. But he was so angry, so determined to see justice done. He said Flora would have to face the consequences of her actions, and that he wouldn't protect her from the law." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "And in your desperation to protect your sister and yourself, you struck him with his own brass lantern." "I only meant to stop him from leaving the room. I grabbed the lantern from his bedside table, and when he tried to push past me, I swung it at him. I never meant to hit him so hard." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this confession with professional interest, spoke up. The blow would have rendered him unconscious immediately. In his condition, with his blood pressure problems, the shock to his system would have been severe. "I thought he was dead," Gordon continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I panicked. I wrapped him in a blanket and carried him out to the sleigh, thinking I could make it look like he'd had a stroke while checking the stable arrangements. But when I got him to the stable block and unwrapped the blanket, he was still breathing." "So you staged the scene to look like a natural death," Miss Marple said. "You positioned him in the chair, arranged the Christmas decorations to look undisturbed, and then hid the broken lantern in the storage room." "I thought it would work," Gordon said desperately. "Uncle Henry was old, he had health problems. Everyone would believe he'd had a stroke. But then you started asking questions, noticing things that didn't fit." Inspector Slack was writing rapidly in his notebook. "And the wax on your boot came from the lantern's candle when you handled the broken pieces. I tried to clean up all the glass, but in the dark, with only the electric lights in the stable, I must have missed some fragments." Miss Marple turned to Flora, who was staring at her brother with tears streaming down her face. "My dear, did you know what Gordon had done when you helped him create the false story about finding your uncle's body together?" Flora shook her head violently. "I had no idea. When Gordon came to get me, he said Uncle Henry had had a stroke in the stable block and that we needed to call for help. I never suspected. I never imagined." "But you did realise that your uncle's death would solve your immediate problem with the trust fund theft," Miss Marple observed. "With him gone, you might have time to replace the missing money before anyone else discovered the discrepancies." "I'm not proud of it," Flora whispered. "But yes, the thought did cross my mind. It seemed like a terrible thing to think, but I couldn't help feeling relieved that I wouldn't have to face Uncle Henry's disappointment and anger." Ned Took, who had been following this extraordinary conversation with wide eyes, cleared his throat nervously. "Should I be going then?" "I've got the rest of my rounds to finish." "I'm afraid not, Mr. Took," Inspector Slack said. "I'll need you to make a formal statement about what you saw this morning. Your testimony about the sleigh ride that supposedly never happened is crucial evidence." Miss Marple moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered grounds of Westlake Manor. In the distance she could see the church spire of St. Mary Mead, and she could hear the faint sound of church bells calling the faithful to Christmas morning service. It should have been a day of joy and celebration, but instead it had become a tragedy of greed, desperation, and family loyalty, twisted into something dark and destructive. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we should examine that sleigh. If Gordon used it to transport his uncle's body, there may be additional evidence, traces of blood, perhaps, or fibres from the blanket he mentioned." The examination of the sleigh proved to be as revealing as Miss Marple had suspected, but it also uncovered one final, crucial piece of evidence that would complete the picture of that morning's tragic events. Chapter 8. Midnight in the strong room. The examination of the pony sleigh proved to be as illuminating as Miss Marple had anticipated. Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock accompanied her to the stable yard, where the small vehicle sat beneath a lean-to shelter, its runners still bearing traces of the morning's journey through the snow. "Here," Dr. Haydock said, pointing to dark stains on the sleigh's upholstered seat. "These look like blood stains to me, though they're partially frozen." Inspector Slack examined the stains with his magnifying glass. Consistent with someone who'd suffered a head injury being transported in this vehicle. "And look here." He indicated several woolen fibres caught on the rough edge of the sleigh's side panel. Grey wool, the same colour as the blanket Gordon mentioned. But it was Miss Marple who made the most significant discovery. As she examined one of the sleigh's runners, she noticed that the metal was discoloured in several places by what appeared to be yellowish deposits. "Inspector," she called, "I think you should examine this runner more closely. Unless I'm very much mistaken, these marks are candle wax, the same substance we found on Gordon's boot." Inspector Slack crouched down to study the runner. "You're quite right, Miss Marple, but how would candle wax come to be on the sleigh runner?" "I suspect," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "that Gordon used his uncle's brass lantern to provide light while he was arranging the scene in the stable block. When he hid the broken lantern in the storage room, some of the wax from the damaged candle must have dripped onto the sleigh runner." They returned to the house to find that Gordon had collapsed into a chair in the drawing room, his head in his hands, while Flora sat nearby, her face pale and her eyes red from weeping. Mrs. Jarvis hovered anxiously in the doorway, uncertain whether to offer tea or simply retreat to the safety of her kitchen. "Mr. Gordon," Inspector Slack said sternly, "I think it's time we examined the strongbox that seems to have been at the centre of this morning's events. I'll need that key." Gordon looked up with a start. "I don't have the key. I told you, it was on Uncle Henry's watch chain." "Which you removed after you killed him," Inspector Slack replied. "The question is, what did you do with it afterward?" Flora, who had been sitting in miserable silence, suddenly spoke up. "It's in the strongbox," she said quietly. "I put it there myself." The statement caused a stir of surprise among the assembled group. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "You put the key inside the strongbox, my dear? However did you manage that?" "After Gordon brought me to the stable block and I saw Uncle Henry's body, I realised what must have happened. Not the details, not exactly how Gordon had killed him, but I knew it wasn't natural causes, and I knew that if anyone examined the strongbox they'd find evidence of my theft." "So you retrieved the key from your uncle's watch chain," Inspector Slack said. Flora nodded miserably. "I took it while Gordon was arranging things in the stable, trying to make it look like Uncle Henry had had a stroke. I went to the breakfast hall and opened the strongbox." "And what did you find inside?" "The real account ledgers, the ones that showed every discrepancy, every fraudulent transaction I'd made. Uncle Henry had been keeping his own records separate from the ones I maintained. He knew exactly how much I'd stolen." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but persistent. "What did you do with those records, Flora?" "I took them out of the strongbox and burned them in the fireplace in the breakfast hall. Then I put the Christmas stocking inside the strongbox instead, along with the key. I thought if anyone looked, they'd assume Uncle Henry had simply secured his charitable donations before his death." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. "The Christmas stocking with the £300 in charity money?" "Yes, I took it from the stable block while Gordon was busy with Uncle Henry's body. I thought it would look natural, as if Uncle Henry had put it there for safekeeping." "But that created a new problem, didn't it?" Miss Marple observed. "You now had the key inside the locked strongbox with no way to retrieve it without breaking open the box itself." Flora's shoulders sagged in defeat. I realised too late how foolish I'd been. In my panic, I'd trapped the key inside the very box I'd been trying to access. But I thought it didn't matter, because everyone would assume Uncle Henry had died of natural causes and the key would be found on his body. "Except that Gordon had already removed the watch chain," Inspector Slack said grimly, which meant the key's absence would eventually be noticed. Gordon finally looked up from his hands. "Flora never told me what she'd done with the key. When you started asking questions about the missing watch chain, I assumed she still had it hidden somewhere. I had no idea she'd locked it inside the strongbox. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. I think, Inspector, that we should open that strongbox now. I have a feeling we'll find more than just the Christmas stocking and the missing key. The breakfast hall was a scene of interrupted preparations. Long tables had been set with white cloths and simple crockery, ready for the Christmas feast that would now never take place. The strongbox was built into the wall behind the serving hatch, its steel door bearing an impressive array of locks and bolts. We'll need a locksmith, Inspector Slack said, examining the mechanism. Or perhaps we could— Actually, Dr. Haydock interrupted, I believe Mrs. Jarvis mentioned that Henry kept a spare key. Something about emergencies. Mrs. Jarvis, who had followed them into the breakfast hall, nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir. Mr. Henry was very careful about such things. He kept a second key in his bedroom safe, in case the first one was ever lost or damaged. The retrieval of the spare key from Henry Westlake's bedroom safe proved to be a simple matter, and within minutes, Inspector Slack was turning the lock of the strongbox. The heavy door swung open to reveal the interior, and the assembled group crowded around to see what secrets it contained. The Christmas stocking lay on the top shelf, exactly as Flora had described, its embroidered surface still pristine despite the morning's events. Beside it lay the missing watch chain, its gold links gleaming in the electric light, and attached to the chain was the original strongbox key. But it was what lay beneath the stocking that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. Several sheets of paper, charred around the edges but still partially legible, showed evidence of having been rescued from a fire. Inspector, she said, lifting the papers carefully, I believe Flora's attempt to destroy the evidence was not entirely successful. These appear to be pages from the original account ledgers. Inspector Slack examined the damaged documents. Bank statements, receipts, transaction records, all showing systematic embezzlement over an 18-month period. And look at this. He held up a partially burned letter bearing the letterhead of a London gaming establishment. A demand for payment of gambling debts in the amount of £2,800 addressed to one Charles Pemberton. Flora buried her face in her hands. I saved that letter because I thought it proved that Charles really did need the money, that he wasn't just lying to me about his debts. Instead, Miss Marple said sadly, it proved that you were being used by a man who cared nothing for you beyond what he could extract from your uncle's charity fund. Gordon stood up abruptly. This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so concerned about my own reputation, if I'd let Flora face the consequences of her actions instead of trying to protect her by killing Uncle Henry— The fault lies with both of you, Inspector Slack said firmly. Miss Flora, you chose to steal money entrusted to your care. Mr. Gordon, you chose to commit murder rather than face the shame of your family's disgrace. Both choices led to the death of a good man who deserved better from his own family. Miss Marple moved to the window of the breakfast hall and looked out at the snow-covered village beyond. The church bells had stopped ringing, and she could see people making their way home from the Christmas morning service, their faces bright with the joy of the season. In a few hours, many of them would have been gathering here for Henry Westlake's generous Christmas breakfast, a tradition that had brought warmth and fellowship to the community for 15 years. There's one more thing, she said quietly, turning back to the group. Inspector, I noticed that there were wax drips on the inside of the strongbox lid. That suggests that someone used a candle or lantern to provide light while working inside the box. The brass lantern, Inspector Slack said with understanding. Gordon used it as a makeshift lamp when he was helping Flora access the strongbox. No, Flora said quickly. Gordon wasn't with me when I opened the strongbox. I used Uncle Henry's lantern myself to see what I was doing in the dark breakfast hall. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Which explains how you came to drop wax on the strongbox lid, and also how some of that same wax came to be transferred to Gordon's boot when he later handled the broken lantern. The physical evidence has been telling us the true story all along. We simply needed to listen to what it was saying. Chapter 9. The Wax, the Runner and the Stocking Holder. The assembled group returned to the drawing room of Westlake Manor, where Inspector Slack arranged the physical evidence on the mahogany table, with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to present complex cases to magistrates and juries. The damaged brass lantern, the charred account papers, the Christmas stocking with its £300 in charity money, and the watch chain with its crucial key lay spread before them like the pieces of a tragic puzzle, finally assembled into a coherent whole. Miss Marple settled herself in her chair near the window, where the grey December light provided the best illumination for her keen observation of the faces around her. Both Gordon and Flora sat in attitudes of complete defeat, their initial attempts at deception having crumbled under the weight of accumulated evidence and their own contradictory statements. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, consulting his notes, "I believe it's time we established exactly what happened here this morning, step by step, so that there can be no confusion about the sequence of events." Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly observing the proceedings with professional interest, leaned forward in his chair. "From a medical standpoint, I can confirm that Mr. Westlake suffered a severe blow to the head, delivered with considerable force. The brass lantern would certainly have been capable of inflicting such an injury." "The attack took place in Mr. Westlake's bedroom," Miss Marple said, picking up the narrative. "Gordon went there in the early hours of the morning, hoping to persuade his uncle not to expose Flora's theft from the charity fund. When Mr. Westlake refused to compromise his principles, Gordon struck him with the brass lantern in a moment of desperation." Gordon's voice was barely audible. "I never meant to kill him. I just wanted him to listen, to understand that Flora wasn't a criminal, just a foolish girl who'd been taken advantage of by an unscrupulous man." "But the blow was fatal," Inspector Slack continued, "or at least it rendered Mr. Westlake unconscious and triggered the series of events that led to his death." Flora looked up with tears in her eyes. "Gordon came to my room and told me that Uncle Henry had had some kind of attack, that we needed to move him to the stable block where the Christmas breakfast was to be held. He said Uncle Henry had specifically asked to be taken there, that he wanted to make sure the arrangements were perfect even if he was feeling unwell." "You believe this story?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I wanted to believe it," Flora whispered. "I was so frightened about what Uncle Henry might do about the missing money. And when Gordon said he was willing to help with the breakfast despite being ill, it seemed like something Uncle Henry might do. He was always so dedicated to his charitable work." Inspector Slack made a note. "So you helped Gordon transport your uncle's body to the stable block using the pony sleigh?" "I thought I was helping to transport a sick man," Flora protested. "Uncle Henry was wrapped in blankets, and in the pre-dawn darkness, I couldn't see clearly. When Gordon said he was unconscious but still breathing, I believed him." Miss Marple studied the young woman's face with her penetrating gaze. "But at some point you realized that your uncle was dead, didn't you? Was it when you arrived at the stable block?" Flora nodded miserably. "When we unwrapped the blankets and I saw Uncle Henry's face in the electric light, I knew immediately that he was gone. But by then, I was already involved, already complicit in whatever Gordon had done." "And that's when you decided to take advantage of the situation," Inspector Slack said bluntly. "You retrieved the strongbox key from your uncle's watch chain and went to destroy the evidence of your embezzlement." "I was terrified," Flora said. "I knew that once Uncle Henry's death was investigated, someone would examine all his financial records. The theft would be discovered, and I'd be ruined. Charles had promised to marry me once his debts were settled. But if I was arrested for embezzlement—" Miss Marple's expression was infinitely sad. "My dear child, surely you must have realized that a man who would encourage you to steal from your own uncle's charity fund was not worthy of your devotion." "I loved him," Flora said simply. "Or I thought I did. When you're young and someone makes you feel special, makes you believe that you're the most important thing in their world, it's easy to do foolish things." Gordon had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Flora's involvement was entirely my fault. If I hadn't killed Uncle Henry, she would never have had the opportunity to access the strongbox. Everything that happened afterward was a consequence of my initial crime." "That may be true," Inspector Slack replied, "but it doesn't excuse Miss Flora's decision to steal from the charity fund in the first place, or her choice to compound that crime by destroying evidence and lying to the police." And Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to examine the evidence on the table more closely. "Inspector, I think it might be helpful if we trace the exact movements of the brass lantern this morning. The pattern of wax deposits tells us a great deal about what happened and when. She picked up the damaged lantern carefully, noting the way the metal housing had been crushed and the glass panels completely shattered. The lantern was in Mr. Westlake's bedroom when Gordon attacked him. The initial damage occurred then, breaking the glass and allowing wax to begin dripping from the damaged candle inside. Gordon then carried the lantern with him when he transported his uncle's body to the stable block, Inspector Slack continued, following Miss Marple's reasoning. The wax dripped onto the sleigh runner during this journey. Precisely. And when Flora used the lantern to provide light while she accessed the strongbox in the breakfast hall, more wax dripped onto the interior of the box. Finally, when Gordon hid the lantern in the storage room of the stable block, the remaining wax transferred to his boot heel as he handled the broken pieces. Dr. Haydock nodded approvingly. It's remarkable how the physical evidence corroborates every aspect of their confessions. The wax traces provide an almost perfect timeline of the morning's events. Mrs. Jarvis, who had been standing quietly in the doorway throughout this discussion, suddenly spoke up. "If I might say something, Inspector, I've been thinking about that codicil we found in Mr. Henry's study, the one that left the manor to Miss Flora." "What about it, Mrs. Jarvis?" "Well, sir, I've seen Mr. Henry's handwriting every day for 15 years, and while that document looked like his hand, there was something not quite right about it. The letters were too careful, too deliberate. When Mr. Henry wrote naturally, his hand had a certain flow to it, but this looked like someone had been copying his style very slowly and carefully." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with interest. "Are you suggesting that the codicil was forged?" "I think it's quite possible, miss, and if it was, then whoever forged it knew enough about Mr. Henry's real intentions to make the forgery believable." Inspector Slack turned to Gordon with a sharp look. "Did you forge that codicil, Mr. Gordon? Were you trying to implicate your sister in your uncle's murder by making it appear that she had a motive to kill him for the inheritance?" Gordon's face flushed with indignation. "I would never do such a thing. I was trying to protect Flora, not implicate her in murder." "Then who created the forged codicil?" Miss Marple asked. "Someone who had access to examples of your uncle's handwriting, someone who knew about his charitable intentions, someone who might benefit from casting suspicion on Flora." The implication of her words hung in the air like smoke. Flora had gone very pale and her hands were trembling as she clutched the arms of her chair. "Flora," Miss Marple said gently, "did you forge that codicil? Were you trying to create a false motive for yourself, hoping that it would distract attention from the real motive of financial theft?" I don't know what you mean," Flora stammered. "Why would I want to implicate myself in Uncle Henry's murder?" "Because," Miss Marple replied with infinite sadness, "a crime of passion over an inheritance might be seen as more understandable, more forgivable, than cold-blooded embezzlement from a charity fund. You thought that if people believed you killed your uncle in a moment of fury over being disinherited, they might have sympathy for you. But if they discovered that you'd been systematically stealing from funds meant for the poor and needy—" Flora's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand the position I was in. Charles said that once we were married, once his inheritance came through, we'd pay back every penny. He said it was just a temporary loan, that Uncle Henry would never even miss the money." "But your uncle did miss it," Inspector Slack said grimly. "He discovered your theft and he was planning to expose you this morning. That's when you realised that your only hope was to make his death appear to be about inheritance rather than embezzlement." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of snow falling against the windows and the distant chiming of the church bells. Outside, the people of St. Mary Mead were going about their Christmas morning activities, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded at the manor house that should have been the centre of their holiday celebration. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her face reflecting the deep sadness that always accompanied the resolution of such cases. Another family destroyed by greed and deception, another Christmas morning forever tainted by violence and betrayal. She'd seen it all too often before, and she knew that the pain radiating outward from this room would touch many innocent lives in the days and months to come. Chapter 10. Revelation before the Christmas pudding flame. The afternoon had worn on with the inexorable weight of official procedures. Inspector Slack had taken formal statements from all parties involved, while Dr. Haydock completed his examination of Henry Westlake's body and confirmed the cause of death as a combination of blunt force trauma and the subsequent stroke it had induced. The village constable had arrived to assist with the arrests, and arrangements had been made for Gordon and Flora to be taken into custody, pending their appearance before the magistrate. Through it all, Miss Marple had remained at Westlake Manor, partly to assist the authorities with their inquiries, but mainly because she felt a deep sense of responsibility to see that the truth was fully revealed and properly understood. Too often, she had observed, the human stories behind criminal acts were lost in the machinery of legal proceedings, and she believed that Henry Westlake's memory deserved better than to be reduced to mere evidence in a murder trial. As evening approached and the formalities drew to a close, Mrs. Jarvis appeared in the drawing-room doorway, her face bearing the exhausted expression of someone who had lived through the worst day of her life. "Inspector," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about the Christmas breakfast that was meant to happen this morning. There are 30 families in the village who are expecting to be fed, and the food is all prepared. It seems a shame to let it go to waste, especially on Christmas Day." Inspector Slack looked up from his paperwork. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Jarvis?" "Well, sir, I know it's not my place to make such decisions, but Mr. Henry would have wanted the breakfast to go ahead. He always said that Christmas was about bringing people together, about making sure no one went hungry or felt forgotten." Miss Marple felt a warmth spread through her chest at the housekeeper's words. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Jarvis. Mr. Westlake's greatest legacy was his generosity to the community, and it would be fitting if that tradition continued despite today's tragedy." Dr. Haydock nodded his agreement. "I'll spread the word around the village. People will understand that it's meant as a memorial to Henry, not a celebration." And so, as the winter darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, the breakfast hall of Westlake Manor was transformed once again into a place of gathering and fellowship. The long tables that had been set so hopefully that morning now hosted a sombre but grateful crowd of villagers who came to pay their respects to Henry Westlake's memory while sharing the feast he had prepared for them. Miss Marple found herself seated at the head table, where she had been placed as the honoured guest who had helped bring the truth to light. Beside her sat Dr. Haydock, Inspector Slack, and the village vicar, who had agreed to say a few words about Henry's life and charitable works. The meal itself was everything that Henry Westlake had intended it to be. Mrs. Jarvis had outdone herself with roasted turkey, honey-glazed ham, and all the traditional accompaniments of a proper Christmas feast. The conversation was subdued but warm, filled with memories of Henry's kindness and generosity over the years. It was as the Christmas pudding was being brought to the table, its surface dancing with blue flames from the brandy Mrs. Jarvis had poured over it, that Miss Marple felt moved to speak about the events of the day. The sight of the flame-crowned pudding seemed to her a fitting symbol, something beautiful and traditional, yet touched by fire that could either warm the heart or burn away everything one held dear. "My friends," she said, rising to her feet as the flames died down and the pudding sat dark and rich before them, "we have gathered tonight in memory of a good man whose life was cut short by the very human failings of greed and desperation. I think it's important that we understand what really happened in this house today, not just the facts that will be presented in court, but the deeper truths about how ordinary people can be led astray by circumstances and poor choices." The assembled villagers listened with respectful attention as Miss Marple carefully laid out the complete sequence of events. She spoke of Flora's vulnerability to the manipulation of an unscrupulous suitor, of Gordon's misguided attempt to protect his sister's reputation at the cost of his uncle's life, and of the web of deception that had grown from these initial crimes. "The brass stocking holder that we found dented on the stable floor was the weapon that first alerted me to the true nature of Mr. Westlake's death," she explained. "The wax traces from his broken lantern told us exactly how that weapon was used and by whom. The glass fragments embedded in Gordon's boot, the wax on the sleigh runner, the drips inside the strong box. Each piece of evidence told part of the story. She went on to describe how Flora's theft of the charity funds had created the initial crisis, how Gordon's discovery of that theft had led to his confrontation with their uncle, and how both siblings had then compounded their crimes in a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of their actions. The forged codicil was perhaps the most cunning aspect of the deception, Miss Marple continued. By creating a false motive related to inheritance, Flora hoped to distract attention from the real motive of financial embezzlement. She calculated, quite correctly, that a crime of passion might be viewed more sympathetically than cold-blooded theft from charity. Inspector Slack, who had been listening to this summary with professional interest, cleared his throat. What I find most troubling about this case is how easily it might have succeeded. If Mr. Tuke hadn't seen Gordon with the sleigh, if the wax evidence hadn't been so clearly preserved, if Miss Marple hadn't noticed the discrepancies in the physical evidence. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, Miss Marple replied gently. Lies require such careful maintenance, such constant vigilance to keep all the details consistent. Eventually, the weight of deception becomes too much for most people to bear. Dr. Haydock raised his glass of wine. To Henry Westlake, a man who lived his life with honesty and generosity, and who deserved better from those who should have loved him most. The toast was echoed around the room, and Miss Marple felt a sense of closure settling over the gathering. The truth had been told, justice would be served, and Henry Westlake's legacy of charitable work would continue through the foundation that would inherit his estate according to his properly executed will. As the evening wound down and the villagers began to make their way home through the snow-covered streets, Miss Marple found herself alone with Mrs. Jarvis in the kitchen, helping to clear away the dishes from the memorial feast. "It's been a terrible day," Mrs. Jarvis said sadly, "but I'm glad we were able to give Mr. Henry the send-off he would have wanted. He always said that food shared with friends was the greatest gift anyone could give." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of the contrast between the morning's tragic revelations and the evening's gentle fellowship. "Mrs. Jarvis, what will you do now? Will you stay on at the manor?" "I expect the children's home will need a housekeeper when they take possession," Mrs. Jarvis replied. "Mr. Henry always said that building was meant to be filled with young voices and laughter. It'll be strange at first, but I think he'd be pleased to know his home was being used to help children who need care and healing." Later that evening, as Miss Marple made her way home through the quiet, snow-covered streets of St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the events of the day. The church bells were chiming 10 o'clock, and lights glowed warmly in the windows of the cottages she passed, each one representing a family gathered around their own Christmas hearth. At her garden gate, she paused to look back toward Westlake Manor, its windows now dark except for a single light in Mrs. Jarvis's quarters. Tomorrow, the legal machinery would continue its work, and Gordon and Flora would begin to face the consequences of their choices. Charles Pemberton would no doubt disappear from Flora's life as quickly as he had entered it, leaving her to face her punishment alone. Miss Marple sighed softly and made her way up the path to her front door. Christmas Day was ending, but its lessons about human nature, both its capacity for selfishness and its potential for redemption, would remain with her long after the snow had melted and spring had returned to St. Mary Mead. "Snow may cover tracks, dear," she murmured to herself, echoing the words she would later share with her friend Dolly Bantry. "But wax, like conscience, leaves a mark even Christmas morning cannot hide." The end.